They locked her in the tool shed behind the church barefoot, belly swollen, and face bruised not from fists, but from silence. Her name was Clara, 17, a maid at St. Mercy orphanage, where whispers weighed heavier than sermons. The Reverend claimed her sin would stain the altar if seen. So, in the cold dawn of December, while the children still slept, they dragged her out back with nothing but a wool blanket and the threat of damnation. No doctor, no water, just the rustling of dry leaves and the distant sound of bells. Inside, Clara curled around her unborn child, whispering hymns to keep the fear away. No one dared speak of her. Not the sisters, not the orphans, not even the wind seemed to pass by that old wooden door, until one morning after 4 days without light, food, or a voice, there came a knock, then silence, then a crack as the wood splintered inward. And standing there, holding a crowbar and something far fiercer than faith, was Sister Eloise, eyes blazing, lips trembling. God doesn't lock away the broken, she said, but men do. Sister Eloise wasn't supposed to be there. The church had transferred her 6 months ago to progressive, they'd said, too compassionate. But something kept pulling her back to St. Mercy, a letter, a dream, a guilt she couldn't scrub out of her soul. She arrived unannounced, her boots still caked in snow from the 3-day ride across frozen country roads. The other nuns gasped. The Reverend's jaw tightened like a fist. But Eloise just asked one question: "Where is Clara?" The silence that followed was louder than any confession. The shed still reeked of varnish and old leather. Clara, when Eloise found her, had collapsed onto a bed of burlap sacks and frozen soil. Her lips were blue, her fingers shaking, and her water had broken. Eloise shouted for help, but none came. The Reverend had barred any aid under threat of excommunication. To help Clara, he said, was to betray God. The other sisters averted their eyes. Some crossed themselves, others turned away weeping. So Eloise did the unthinkable. She ripped the habit from her head, rolled up her sleeves, and delivered that baby herself. No midwife, no towels, just her trembling hands and the fire of fury in her chest. Clara screamed until her voice cracked, and then a child's cry cut through the cold. A baby girl, small, alive, wrapped in a nun's robe and baptized in sweat and tears. But Eloise knew the Reverend wouldn't let this stand, so she gave Clara a choice. Stay, and they'll bury you in shame. Leave now, and I'll help you disappear. Clara hesitated, her arms wrapped tight around the infant whose skin was already blotched pink from the cold. "Where would we go?" she whispered. "I have no family, no name anyone respects." Eloise looked toward the horizon, where the pine trees stood like soldiers in the fog. "There's a woman I knew years ago, a healer. Lives beyond Millstone Pass. If we leave now, ride hard, we can reach her before nightfall." Behind them, the church bell tolled, not for mass, for alarm. The Reverend had noticed their absence. They didn't wait. Clara climbed onto the mule Eloise borrowed from the stable so legally, of course, and held her child close. The wind was merciless, but freedom was colder still. Eloise rode beside her, jaw clenched, heart pounding. They didn't make it far. By sundown, 3 riders crested the ridgment of the cloth, by garment only. The Reverend had dispatched them like hounds. One held a rifle, another a rope, and the third a silver crucifix that swung like a noose in the wind. "Return the girl," they shouted, "or we'll have you both tried for witchcraft and sedition." Eloise placed herself between Clara and the men. "You'll raise a rifle at a mother And a nun? The man raised it without hesitation. What followed wasn't a shootout, it was a standstill carved in trembling breath and frost-bitten fear. Clara sobbed. The child whimpered. Eloise's voice, steady and low, said, I've broken no law but that of your cowardice. And then a crack split the silence. A warning shot fired into the snow. The riders weren't bluffing. Eloise had no weapon, no authority, just a half-frozen baby and a heart too stubborn to die. Suddenly, hoofbeats echoed from behind. Another rider, fast, fierce. The snow parted beneath her, like waves before a prow. It was Sister Miriam, once quiet, once compliant, until she heard the child's cry and remembered the infant she'd lost long ago. She rode bareback, hair wild, holding nothing but a lantern and a scream. Stand down! She yelled at the men. You'll not shoot while God watches. The men faltered for a second, a crack in their righteous armor. But the man with the rope stepped forward. You're protecting sin. Miriam raised her voice. And what are you? Shepherds who abandon the bleeding? Soldiers of shame? The standoff teetered. Wind howled through the trees. Clara moaned behind them, slipping from the mule, her strength nearly gone. Then the rifleman shifted his stance. His boot crunched forward. His finger brushed the trigger. And Eloise moved. Not with fury, but with purpose. She stepped in front of Clara, held up both hands, and shouted, If you believe this child's birth offends heaven, then strike me down and let him judge. The silence that followed was eternal, until the man lowered the rifle and turned away. One by one, the others followed. No words, just the sound of reins tugged, snow disturbed, and shame carried off into the trees. Eloise dropped to her knees. Miriam caught Clara before she fell. The child cried, unaware of the bloodless war just won. They had survived, but the Reverend would not forget. Back at St. Mercy, the Reverend stood in the chapel alone. Candles burned low. A crimson sash draped across his shoulders like a noose waiting for judgment. Word of the standoff had reached him before the riders returned. But what truly unsettled him was this. They hadn't brought back Clara, nor the child, nor Eloise. They had chosen silence over obedience. That night, he ordered the orphanage sealed. No visitors, no prayers. He paced the halls like a wolf circling its own shadow, muttering scripture twisted to justify his rage. He sent telegrams to the bishop, letters to the sheriff, but answers came slow in the snow, and fear travels faster than authority. Meanwhile, Eloise, Clara, Miriam, and the newborn now called Grace sought refuge in an abandoned farmhouse near the edge of Pine Hollow. The walls were crumbling, the roof leaked, but it was warm. It was safe. For now, every morning, they watched the road from the attic window. Every night, they took turns staying awake. The baby slept between two quilts, stitched from old robes. Clara regained strength, but her eyes held the knowledge that peace was never promised, only borrowed. Eloise prayed aloud each evening, not to a God who demanded silence, but to the one who hears the cries no one else will. And outside, in the forest that now shielded them, winter drew its breath, preparing for one final merciless storm. The blizzard struck on a moonless night. It came like a ghost-snow warning, no whisper, just a wall of white wind that swallowed the farmhouse whole. The door groaned, the chimney wailed, and the baby Grace began to cough. At first they thought it was the cold, but by morning her skin had gone pale and her breaths grew shallow. Clara wept as she cradled her daughter, eyes wild with panic. Eloise leaned close, hand on the child's chest, feeling for rhythm. She needs medicine, she whispered. Now. The nearest doctor was 2 towns away. The road was impassable. But Miriam remembered the healer, the woman Eloise once mentioned. Millstone Pass was dangerous, but not impossible. I'll go, Eloise said, standing before anyone could argue. You stay. Keep her warm. Feed her broth. I'll be back before dusk. She rode alone through the snow, face raw, knuckles white against the reins. The wind clawed at her skin, but something deeper pushed her forward, something born not of duty but of love. But the Reverend had not been idle. He had sent word ahead fabrications of sin and sorcery. The town beyond the pass now saw Eloise not as a nun, but as a heretic. Eloise arrived at the healer's cabin just after midday, her cloak stiff with frost, lips bleeding from the cold. She pounded on the door, barely able to stand. The woman who opened it was older than Eloise remembered. White hair like tangled yarn, wrists thin as willow twigs. But her eyes, those were the same, sharp, unforgiving, and full of secrets. I heard the stories, she said before Eloise could speak. They say you birthed a demon in God's house, that you harbor the spawn of shame. Eloise's voice cracked. They lied. The woman stared at her for a long time, then stepped aside. I know, but lies carry weight when spoken from pulpits. Inside, the healer worked quickly. Bottles, herbs, and poultices were packed into a satchel with bone-deep precision. If you're found with this, they'll call it witchcraft. Eloise gripped the bag. Let them! She turned to leave, but the healer caught her sleeve. There's a price. Eloise frowned. I have no coin. The woman shook her head. Not that kind. If you take this cure, you don't return as a nun, you return as a mother. You choose them over the church. Eloise paused. Outside, the snow whispered warnings. Inside, something heavier shifted in her chest. I made that choice the moment I broke the door, she said. Then she disappeared into the storm. The journey back was slower. Snow had buried the trail. Her mule limped. Twice she fell into a drift so deep she feared she wouldn't rise again. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Grace gasping for breath. That was enough. By dusk, she spotted the farmhouse chimney, smoke barely curling through the storm. But something was wrong. The front door was open. Her stomach dropped. She ran inside, heart hammering against frozen ribs. The cradle was overturned. Miriam's shawl lay in the snow, stained with blood. And Clara was gone. In her place sat a letter, scrawled in trembling ink. They came at noon, said they'd take us to safety. I didn't believe them, but they had grace. Please, if you find this, run, or come save us. I can't tell which is braver. Eloise read it 3 times before her knees buckled. The satchel slipped from her hands. The cure useless now if the child had been taken. She had risked everything. And still they came. But something in her rose then. Not fury, not grief, resolve. She stepped back into the storm, no longer running from the church. This time she was running toward it. St. Mercy had changed. Not the stone walls or the iron gate, but the feeling thicker, colder, like something sacred had been scraped away. As Eloise approached on foot, covered in snow and fury, no guards stopped her. No bells rang. The Reverend must have thought her dead or lost to the woods. She walked through the orphanage doors like a ghost resurrected. Inside, the chapel flickered with candlelight. At the altar stood the Reverend, draped in crimson, preaching to no one. and at the back pew, arms wrapped around a bundled cloth Clara. She turned. Their eyes met. Behind her, cradled against her chest, was Grace, still breathing. But Clara's lips trembled. He says we're forgiven, that if we stay, he'll let us raise her under God's law. Eloise stepped forward, voice calm but carved from iron. You trust the man who locked you in a shed? The Reverend turned, slow and deliberate. You defied holy order and returned in rags like a beggar. Eloise didn't flinch. No, I returned as a mother, and mothers don't ask permission to protect their children. She raised the satchel, dropped it on the pew beside Clara. The cure. It's not too late. The Reverend stepped forward. That's poison. Eloise stepped between him and the girl. So is your mercy. For a moment, silence held its breath. Then Clara stood not behind Eloise, but beside her. And the Reverend, realizing he no longer commanded the fear he once did, lowered his eyes. Alone now, in a house once built on faith, now shaken by courage, the Reverend resigned in silence. Days after that final confrontation, he packed his vestments into a leather trunk and boarded a westbound train. No farewell sermon, no procession. Just a quiet departure under a gray sky, as if the land itself had grown tired of judgment. St. Mercy didn't collapse, it evolved. Sister Miriam took over the orphanage's care, stripping it of cruelty like peeling rot from wood. The other nuns, emboldened by Eloise's stand, began to speak more gently, to listen, to question. The chapel, once a place of punishment, became a sanctuary again, not for penance, but for healing. Clara and Grace stayed, not hidden, not shamed, but welcomed. The children adored Grace Tiny, stubborn, with a laugh that could split clouds. Clara found work in the kitchen, teaching the girls how to knead bread and carry themselves like women unafraid to take up space. And Eloise? She never asked to be called mother. But the children did anyway. She split her days between tending the garden and writing letter-stow bishops to judges, to women in distant towns who whispered stories too dangerous for daylight. She signed each letter with two names, hers and Grace's, because the fight was never just for one child, it was for all of them. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted fast, like even winter wanted to forget the sins it had covered. Green crept into the fields around St. Mercy, and wildflowers grew where boot prints once pressed hard into frozen dirt. Grace took her first steps beneath the old sycamore behind the chapel, the same tree where Eloise once stood with arms outstretched, daring judgment. Clara cried watching her daughter wobble toward the garden, fists clenched, eyes fearless. Like her mother, Eloise said, standing nearby. Clara laughed through her tears. Like you. Eloise didn't argue. She had learned that some truths didn't need to be corrected, only lived. That afternoon they received a letter from a convent in San Miguel. A young novice had heard whispers of what happened in St. Mercy and wanted to learn how to make a place like it. Not a fortress. A refuge? Eloise read it aloud in the candlelight, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer alongside dozens of others. Because St. Mercy was no longer alone. It had become a ripple. Years passed, as quietly as healing does. Grace grew into a girl with wild curls and ink-stained fingers. She asked hard questions in the chapel and planted sunflowers beside the graves of those no one else remembered. She called Eloise Mama L, and no one corrected her. Clara never married. She didn't need to. Her love had already taken root in the child she raised and the hand she held steady in the kitchen each morning. The children who had once stared at Clara with confusion now called her brave. Some even said they wanted to be locked in a shed if it meant someone would fight for them like that. Eloise watched it all like a farmer watches seed become harvest, not with pride, but with peace. One evening, long after the lamps were lit and supper had cooled, she stood outside the chapel, eyes turned toward the stars. Clara stepped beside her. "She'll never know what you did for her," Clara whispered. Eloise smiled. "She doesn't need to. She's here. That's enough." The bell in the chapel rang ounces soft, full, not a warning, but a welcome. And for the first time in her life, Eloise believed not just in God, but in goodness. Not all heroes ride stallions. Some wear worn robes and carry babies through blizzards. Some speak truth in whispers when shouts are punished. Some break doors not to escape, but to set others free. This story didn't end with a gunfight or a gallows. It ended with something far rarer in the Wild West: a second chance. Eloise didn't change the world with violence. She changed it with a choice to protect the shamed instead of shame the broken, to disobey injustice disguised as faith, to see the divine in the discarded. And Clara? She proved that dignity isn't granted by title or church, but claimed in silence, in survival, and in the love wrapped inside a blanket on a bitter night. St. Mercy became holy not because of the altar, but because someone dared to say, "No more." Sometimes salvation isn't in sermons or scripture, but in a crowbar, a cradle, and the courage to open a locked door. If you ever find yourself standing at a locked door, whether in body, heart, or spirit, remember this: the people who tell you to stay quiet are often the ones most afraid of what your voice might free. The people who preach shame loudest are often trying to drown out their own, but the people who break things traditions, silence, rules, not out of rebellion, but out of love, they are the ones who remake the world in better shapes. And sometimes the smallest life barely born, barely breathing, can turn the coldest chapel into a home. So if you ever see someone shivering in a dark place, don't just pray the door opens. Be the one who breaks it.